This is Bloomberg Law with June Grasso from Bloomberg Radio.
A federal trial is beginning this week in Amazon's hometown to decide whether the world's largest online retailer tricked its customers into joining Prime and then made it difficult to cancel the membership. Prime provides subscribers with perks that include faster shipping, video streaming, and discounts at Whole Foods for a fee of $139 annually. It's a key and growing part of Amazon's business with more than 200 million members, bringing in more than $12 billion in net revenue in the last quarter, a 12% increase from the same period last year. But the Federal Trade Commission says Amazon misled customers into signing up for Prime and then made it very difficult to cancel. Joining me is Matthew Schettenhelm, Bloomberg Intelligence litigation and government analyst. Matt, explain why the FTC is suing Amazon.
Yeah, so this is a lawsuit that the FTC filed 2 years ago alleging that Amazon's Prime cancellation and its subscription process doesn't comply with federal law. There's a 2010 federal law called the Restoring Online Shoppers' Confidence Act that addresses those membership programs that you can kind of sign up for and they can automatically renew. And there are some terms that the federal law requires that the company be very clear about what those terms are, that the customer make informed consent to those terms, and that any ability to cancel that sign up is simple, uses simple mechanisms. And the FTC says that Amazon falls short on all three of those claims, and it's trying to obtain consumer redress and impose civil penalties on the company.
Let's start with the FTC's contention that Amazon makes it difficult for consumers to purchase an item without also subscribing to Prime, so it sort of tricks them into subscribing for Prime.
Yeah, that's right. This goes back to when Lena Khan was chair of the FTC, and there's a big focus on sort of dark patterns and nudging consumers to do things that maybe are against their will. And that's the allegation here, that as consumers went to maybe buy a product on Amazon, Amazon sort of forced them into this process of also signing up for Prime. Basically tricked them is the allegation. And so Amazon says, no, our process was very clear. They tried to move a motion to dismiss on this and tried to move for summary judgment, but the judge wouldn't allow it. He said, look, reasonable people could disagree about this. This needs to go to a jury. So on that issue and all the others, the jury is about to take that question up.
The FTC also claims that getting out of a Prime subscription was too complicated. It required the customer to affirm their desire to cancel membership on 3 pages, and internally, Amazon employees call the process the Iliad.
Yeah, so the law requires a simple mechanism to cancel these signups. And yes, I think it's going to be harmful evidence that the FTC will present to the jury that there were some comments made by Amazon employees that describe this process as very difficult. And as you said, even characterizing it as the Iliad, I think in a reference to the Odyssey and how difficult this can be to get through for consumers. Now, Amazon pushes back on that and says, no, actually, we have data showing that people figure it out. There's always going to be a couple of exceptions, and these stray comments by employees don't really characterize how the process works. So again, here, the judge looked at both sides and said, you know what, I can't decide. This is a fair question to toss to a jury, and so that's going to be presented to jurors this week and next.
I have to say that a lot of companies seem to make it difficult to get out of subscriptions. I mean, sometimes you'll sign up online, but you have to call in order to get out of the subscription. Does Amazon really stand out from these other companies that seem to do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a point that Amazon's going to push, that, look, there isn't a lot of clarity about what is a simple cancellation method, and the industry follows pretty similar practices on this sort of thing. This is pretty industry standard. And to me, like, one point that Amazon's going to raise, the FTC tried to do a rulemaking on this statute to add more clarity to it. And that was over the past couple of years. And when they did that, when they first announced that rulemaking, they said this federal law that requires a simple cancellation process, it isn't very clear. So the industry, I think, is struggling with, okay, what exactly is too much? And Amazon had to make a calculation on that point. It had to look to other industry practices. And Amazon says, look, what we have in place, maybe it's not the simplest that you could possibly imagine, but that's not what the law requires. It's pretty simple. You do have to click through a couple things, but that's sufficient to qualify as simple when you consider the industry standard practice in Amazon's view. And
did the FTC give Amazon a chance to correct this before they brought suit?
My understanding is that Amazon's already changed its processes in material respects. And so I think at this point, the fight is mostly about going after the company for practices in the past that have changed already, and potentially seeking what could be significant financial penalties against the company for its past practices. So I don't see it as much about injunctive relief or trying to change Amazon's practices going forward, as much it is trying to penalize Amazon allegedly for not following the law since around 2015 and going forward.
I wondered because I thought, the jurors will probably go online and try to cancel and see what happens. But you're saying that's not the cancellation process that's there now.
My understanding is this is focused on a previous version of the cancellation process, and I suspect the judge will discourage the jurors from investigating on their own.
I know the judge will, but, jurors sometimes don't listen to those little things. And the judge has already ruled against Amazon on a few issues pre-trial, including limiting the legal defense that Amazon can raise at trial.
Yeah, that's right. Amazon has repeatedly had a difficult time with the judge. Judge John June, he refused to dismiss the case in May of 2024 when Amazon asked for that. He refused to grant an early appeal of the case in July of this year. And then last week, he granted summary judgment in part to the Federal Trade Commission to sort of narrow a couple of the issues that would go to the jury. He refused to grant summary judgment for Amazon, but he sort of very narrowly said, a couple of these issues, look, there's no way, Amazon, you're going to win on this point or that point. Still, I think the core of the question is going to these jurors, but he did narrow it a little bit. He also said that a couple Amazon officers who worked on these processes could be held personally liable if the jury concludes that Amazon violated the law knowingly.
Yeah, and he ruled that the FTC doesn't have to prove every single example of Amazon's sign-up and cancellation procedures are deceptive and can focus on a representative sample.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it sort of narrowed the issues a little bit, narrowed the evidence that will go before the jury. As I said, Amazon's really had a tough time with Judge John June here. And I think the question is, if Amazon lets the jury rule on liability, on whether Amazon violated the law or not, and whether it did it knowingly, it goes back to the judge then to set the financial penalties. And when Amazon's had such a difficult time with this judge, is that really something that it's going to want to do? That's going to be a real consideration for the company as it thinks about potentially settling this case.
Yeah, so in July, the judge admonished Amazon for withholding 70,000 documents, saying the conduct was tantamount to bad faith. So it doesn't appear that Amazon has earned the judge's trust.
Right. It's been a tough go throughout this case. And, I thought Amazon might have a decent chance at getting some of this case narrowed on its motion to dismiss, that a request for early appeal on this stuff might have a small chance. But time after time, this judge has let this case advance, as you said, criticized the company for some of its practices as it's defended this. So I'm not sure that Amazon's going to feel very comfortable letting the judge decide how much it should pay to resolve this.
Let's talk about the exposure of the company, because each violation of that Restore Online Shoppers Confidence Act allows for penalties of more than $53,000 per violation. So how much money are we talking about here?
All right, so you get to absurd math really quickly when you deal with numbers like that. If you're talking about tens of millions of Amazon Prime subscribers, and I think Amazon's expert was talking somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 40 million Amazon users, and you multiply that times 50,000, it breaks my calculator. And so the judge ultimately using that number would have to settle on a civil penalty that is meaningful to the company, but not a violation of due process, not so unreasonable. There's also a push from the FTC for consumer redress, not just civil penalties, but the FTC's expert says that when you look at how much consumers paid that they shouldn't have here, he calculates the damages close to $1 billion just for that. So $1 billion for consumer redress, or nearly that, and then civil penalties that, as we said, could easily reach absurd billions of dollars, but likely would get into the $1 billion range as well. And so even with a company, with the resources like Amazon, it's really hard for any judgment to be disruptive to a company like Amazon that has, annual profits in the, 60, $70 billion range. It's hard to be material, but this might get their attention when numbers like that are in play. So I think when you add all of that up, there's going to be considerable pressure for the company to settle this before the judge gets to decide on what is the reasonable penalty.
But that's a really difficult calculation for Amazon to make, isn't it? So what, they'll watch the jurors through the trial and see whether any of them are reacting favorably to their arguments? I mean, it's really hard to read a jury.
It's very difficult to predict exactly when these companies will settle in trial. I've seen cases settle at the beginning of trial. I've seen cases settle at the very end, right before we're about to get a verdict. I think it's reasonable to see how it's going, get a read on the jurors. It's possible they take their chances, because one of the things that Amazon has going for it is that for the judge to impose civil penalties here, it's not enough that Amazon violated this federal law we've talked about, but also, the FTC has to prove that Amazon did so knowingly. And so I think Amazon's going to have an argument that, okay, look, even if we did technically not give consumers a simple method to cancel, if this number of clicks is a couple too many, did we really know that knowingly, given the limited FTC guidance that's out there, given that the FTC itself has said that this isn't simple? So there's actually a chance for the company to be found liable in the sense that it violated the law, but not subject to these serious financial penalties. And so if I'm Amazon, that's the kind of thing I'd be watching out for. But I think, you might want to think about settling. If I'm Amazon, you might want to think about settling, before the jury returns its verdict, because you have the prospects to win with the jurors. And so that should help your negotiation posture with the FTC in reaching sort of a reasonable settlement. If you lose with the jurors, that argument falls away. You've already lost, and it's all a question of how bad it's going to be.
Are there internal documents that talk about that Iliad-like process?
I mean, I think there is some internal evidence that won't look great here. And you think about how is a reasonable juror going to think about, Amazon employees talking about their process like, some of these allegations claim. it might not be a great look to a juror, and a juror looking at a company with significant resources like Amazon and thinking maybe about how much they've spent on their own Amazon account. And, you can see why a company could be nervous. Anytime a case like this goes to a jury, it's going to be unpredictable. It's going to be risky for a company. So, a lot of pressure to settle, to just make the thing go away for a sum that won't be material for a company like Amazon.
Like other companies, Amazon has been attempting to forge friendlier ties with President Trump. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that across a number of companies right now. There's often a question, where companies can fight aggressively against this administration, or they can choose to not rock the boat. And I don't know how much this case will fit into that paradigm. It's a case that came during the Biden administration, and it was continued under the Trump administration. But, I think that probably does play into part of the calculation as well. Like, how aggressive do we really want to be here in fighting? And a settlement that isn't material might be better to make the whole thing go away.
The FTC has another antitrust case against Amazon that's going to trial in 2027?
Yes, that's right. So my colleague Jen Rhee covers the antitrust side for us on that. And so, yeah, that's in many ways a much more significant threat for the company than this, which is really focused on, sort of a discrete issue, as we said, a past practice. But Amazon faces, much more significant threats on the antitrust front. And I think so that's a good point as well. You look at this stuff in the big picture, and do you want to really be resisting this administration? Maybe the antitrust case plays into that calculation.
Coming up next on the Bloomberg Law Show, I'll continue this conversation with Matthew Schettenhelm of Bloomberg Intelligence. Jimmy Kimmel is returning to the air tonight, but not everywhere. I'm June Grasso, and you're listening to Bloomberg. Jimmy Kimmel Live will return to the air tonight, ending a suspension Walt Disney imposed following controversial remarks the late-night host made about the shooting death of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Disney's decision to suspend the show followed pressure from both the federal government and independent operators of ABC stations. Brendan Carr, the Republican chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, criticized Kimmel's remarks on a podcast and suggested the company could lose its broadcast licenses.
But frankly, when you see stuff like this, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or, there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead.
But two Republican senators, Ted Cruz of Texas and Rand Paul of Kentucky, attacked the FCC chairman's actions, with Cruz accusing Carr of mafioso tactics.
Look, I like Brendan Carr. He's a good guy. He's the chairman of the FCC. I work closely with him. But what he said there is dangerous as hell. He says, we can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way.
Yeah.
And I got to say, that's right out of Goodfellas. That's right out of a mafioso coming into a bar going, nice bar you have here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it.
So, Matt, Kimmel's coming back on the air tonight, but some stations are not carrying the show.
Right. So the FCC rules say that local stations have the right to preempt national network content. And what we're seeing now is that two of those bigger local station owners, Nexstar and Sinclair, are exercising their right to preempt that network programming. And so I think this is, directly tied to FCC Chair Brendan Carr's push the other day on a podcast. He told those companies, look, you can do this. If you don't believe that Jimmy Kimmel's content is in the public interest, you as a local station owner have this right to preempt it. All these local stations negotiate contracts with the networks that protect this right. And so this is just an exercise under those FCC rules. But maybe because the FCC chairman told them to do this directly, and they have an incentive to follow what the FCC chairman asked them to do.
The stations that aren't taking the show tonight, are they ones that are looking to merge?
Nexstar, yes. Nexstar has recently announced a $6 billion deal to acquire Tegna, another owner of TV stations. And it's really important that the FCC be supportive of that for two reasons. One, the FCC has to approve the transaction because it involves swapping licenses from Tegna to Nexstar. The FCC has to sign off on that. And even more importantly, there's an FCC rule right now that says no broadcast station can reach more than 39% of U.S. households. This deal would let Nexstar reach something like 70, 80% of U.S. households. So they need the FCC to scrap that rule first. And so there's a real incentive when the FCC chairman asks you to do something, or at least strongly encourages you to do something. When you need all these steps for a major deal to happen, you have a strong incentive to go along with that. Sinclair doesn't have a pending deal in the same, at least not of the same scale right now, but it also is a big supporter of this deregulation that the FCC is working on, the 39% cap and a couple other rules that the FCC is looking at easing.
Why do you think Disney brought Kimmel back?
Well, there was, significant pressure, I think, public pressure on the company, raising concerns about whether the company was folding to government pressure here. When it was initially announced, they were deliberately, I think, cautious about not saying how long the suspension of the programming would last. And so I think it's possible that this is a response to that public pressure to bring him back pretty quickly.
There was a lot of negative reaction from conservatives about taking Kimmel off the air and the threat to free speech. But is Carr still standing by his words?
Yeah, I think Brendan Carr is saying, look, I wasn't threatening the companies on this. I was pointing out how the law works. But yeah, it was sort of surprising to see Senator Ted Cruz in particular call out Brendan Carr for those comments. And that's when you saw Brendan Carr sort of pulling back a little bit and maybe not using quite the same tone, but still saying, look, here's how FCC processes work. I was just talking about that. It seems like a little bit of a softening in the tone, at least from Brendan Carr, after, a pretty important senator, Ted Cruz, who runs the Commerce Committee, the Senate Commerce Committee that oversees the FCC, spoke out pretty strongly. And so I think it's possible that his sort of pullback, at least a softening on his comments, was in response to that.
Always good to talk to you, Matt. Thanks so much. That's Matthew Schettenhelm, Bloomberg Intelligence litigation and government analyst. Coming up next, Google is facing another breakup possibility in court. I'm June Grasso, and this is Bloomberg. The Justice Department has opened its offensive in court to force a breakup of Google before the Virginia federal judge who's already ruled the search giant illegally monopolized advertising technology markets. Judge Leonie Brinkema is hearing testimony over 2 weeks from website publishers, advertisers, tech experts, and Google's own employees about whether the company should be forced to divest a key piece of its business, the advertising exchange AdX. Joining me is Bloomberg Intelligence senior litigation analyst Jennifer Rhee. Jen, can you tell us about the judge's decision that Google illegally monopolized ad tech markets?
Well, the liability decision has already been made that at least for some tools that Google has in what's called the ad tech stack, it has a monopoly position, and it has undertaken illegal conduct to maintain those monopolies. Under the U.S. law, it isn't illegal to have a monopoly, but once you have one, you can't do things that exclude competition in order to stay in that monopoly position. There were 3 products that Google has that the DOJ alleged to be monopolized, and one of those was called a publisher ad server, one was called an ad exchange, and one were a series of tools on the advertiser side. So if you think about, advertisers and digital advertisers and publishers coming together to place an advertisement on a website, the publishers have a tool, the advertisers have a tool, and then there's an exchange in between them to conduct an auction for an advertiser to actually bid on space and win that space and pay for that space and run their ad. The court decided on the advertiser side, Google didn't have a monopoly, that the Department of Justice didn't define the market in a proper way that sort of outlined a specific competitive product, and failing to properly identify the exact market they're talking about that's monopolized, you kind of fail across the board. So that dropped out. But what stayed in the case and where the judge did find liability was with the publisher ad server and the ad exchange. So the publisher ad server is a tool that the publishers that have space on their website that they're selling to an advertiser, it's where they can manage that inventory and where they can then access the ad exchange, and the ad exchange is where the auction would take place.
This gets very technical. Can you tell us the main thing that the judge found Google did that was anti-competitive?
The judge found a number of things, but the main conduct of Google that the judge said was anti-competitive and harmed the competitive process was tying. In antitrust, tying is when a company has a product that's a must-have product or where they have market power and consumers want to use that product, but that seller of that product has a second product that's not as desirable, and they leverage the must-have product to force customers to buy the second product. So in this case, there was this very valuable inventory that Google had in its own ad exchange. This inventory was really valuable because advertisers were on that exchange through the ad products that Google has, because it also placed ads on Google Search. And as we know, Google Search is a monopoly product. It's been deemed that by a court. Most searches are done by Google. And so advertisers want to be able to place ads when a search is conducted and on that search page. So Google has this great inventory of advertiser demand, and that advertiser demand feeds into its ad exchange. And what Google said is, hey, publishers, if you want access to that demand, you have to use our publisher ad server. You can't use any other rival publisher ad server. And in that way, Google ties its ad exchange to its publisher ad server. And so what does that do, June? It blocks all the other competitors out for these products, and it keeps this entire transaction within Google's ad tech stack. And Google's now extracting fees all along the way, because at each step of the process, there's some fee that's taken by the host of these ad tech tools. When an auction is won and an ad is paid for, Google's taking fees for that. And so it manipulated this process by controlling all of these pieces. And that's essentially what the court found. So the primary finding was this tying of the publisher ad server of Google. It's called DSP, that's what Google calls it, to its ad exchange, which is called AdX.
This trial is going to determine the remedy, and the Justice Department is asking that Google be required to sell off some of its tech?
Yes, that's right. So the judge is looking about what do we do about this monopolistic conduct, and what the DOJ has proposed its own set of remedies, and Google has proposed its set of remedies, and the judge is now going to have to decide. And the DOJ basically says, look, the only way to fix this is to force Google to sell the ad exchange. That's the AdX product to a buyer that's subject to the DOJ approval, because this is so technical and there's so many things Google could do to manipulate the process. If all we do is impose behavioral remedies and say, Google, stop doing what's illegal, there's so many other sneaky ways Google could come in there, manipulate the process, and pervert the process to benefit itself. And the only way to really prevent that, and a really easy and streamlined and kind of clear, concise way of doing that, is to force Google to sell the ad exchange. And maybe also, by the way, DSP, its publisher ad server. That's kind of a contingent remedy. The DOJ is proposing sort of a strange phased divestiture of that product, where at first, basically, Google has to just make it a little bit more interoperable, provide access to APIs so publishers could migrate their product, their inventory off of that publisher to another one, and make some of its code available to be run by a neutral organization, sort of opening it up a little bit, but not fully selling it. But if that all doesn't work to fix competition, then fully divest it. So it's kind of like they're saying divest the ad exchange and sort of open up the publisher ad server and maybe divest that if needed.
I mean, what would that do to Google? How much of a loss would that be for Google?
billions of dollars of ad revenue. Advertising is the main, money-making product of a lot of websites. Search is free, and YouTube is free, and Google Maps is free. And a lot of these products are free because they make their money via this ad revenue. And they make a lot of money, not just placing ads on a search page when somebody does search, but also via this ad tech stack and via the placement of ads between other digital publishers and advertisers.
And what is Google proposing instead?
So what Google's proposing, obviously, is to not have to sell anything. And just what's called a behavioral remedy. We're going to change the way we conduct our business. So they're saying that they would remove that tie. They would allow publishers to have access of this great and unique demand that comes from the ad network products that fits in the ad exchange to make bids. Will let you have access to that, at least demand for open web display ads. That's different from an ad that's a search ad. Will allow you to use other publisher ad networks and still have access to that demand. So we'll just remove that tie. And also, they had imposed some pricing rules on publishers, and they had forced them to set price floors that were unified. They'd say, well, we'll allow publishers to do what they want to. We'll open up some of our rules. If they want to set different price floors for different bidders, rather than a unified price floor for everyone, we'll let them do that. And they also had some technical things they'd implemented that advantaged Google's own tools, gave them special priorities, or gave them the ability to sort of see bids and adjust and match bids so that they could win. They say, we'll not use that stuff. We've already phased some of that out, Google says, and we'll phase all the rest of it out. We'll get rid of all these technical things that we've done in this process that advantage us and advantage our tools. So we'll make the whole process more neutral. And generally, we'll make it a lot easier. All of these products will make them interoperable. We'll make it easier for publishers to use Google tools on the ad network side in conjunction with other ad tech providers, some other ad exchange of another company or some other publisher ad server from some other company. So publishers now can sort of mix and match rather than using the whole Google stack.
During a May hearing, did the judge hint that she was considering seriously the government's argument to force a sale?
She has to explore all of this. She has to dig into all of this, and she did suggest in a hearing that, she's considering that. But bear in mind, in the Google search case, which is much farther along than this, where we already have the remedies that have been imposed on Google for now, pending appeal, that judge also very seriously appeared to consider the prospect of forcing Google to divest Chrome, but didn't ultimately impose that remedy. The judge has to explore all of the possibilities in order to come up with those possibilities that she thinks are going to be the best in this case to basically stop the anti-competitive conduct and restore healthy competition in the market.
What kind of testimony will there be at trial? She's heard a lot already from the first trial.
Right. Now, a lot of this is going to be very technical. So I think what's already started are some of the entities that have been harmed by Google's conduct, for instance, rival publisher ad servers that can't get business because they don't have access to this desirable demand on AdX, talking about how it's hurt them and supporting the idea that the only thing that would help would be divestitures. So right now, the DOJ putting on witnesses, talking about how they've been hurt by the conduct, why they think just behavioral remedies won't work, and why they think divestitures will be needed. Google will very likely put on some very technical people that will talk about how difficult and complicated it would be to force a structural change, to force a divestiture, and the fact that it could have all sorts of bad, unanticipated consequences.
You mentioned Judge Mehta backed off on breaking up Google. It's a difficult decision for a judge. If she did that, would it be precedential?
It really would, June, because first, there isn't this precedent, right? Because the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission haven't really brought a lot of monopoly lawsuits in the last 30 years or so, 40 years. The last really big one was Microsoft. That was by the Department of Justice, and the department did initially seek a divestiture, and they weren't able to win that in court ultimately after there was an appeal. And it would be precedential because where we've seen divestitures has really been in a different context. It's been where a merger took place that in and of itself was illegal, that it was illegal for Company A to buy Company B, and now they have to divest Company B. A very different situation than when the initial, in this case, Google actually bought the publisher ad server. It was a company called DoubleClick, and they bought the ad exchange. But the judge said that acquisition was not anti-competitive. Right? So it's not a situation where you have an anti-competitive acquisition. So to require a divestiture for bad conduct would be fairly precedential today. And this judge has a little more leeway than Judge Mehta had in the Google search case, because in that case, Judge Mehta was really bound by the precedent from the Microsoft decision, which was an appellate court within his circuit. This case is not in that circuit. It's in the Eastern District of Virginia, and those cases can be persuasive for this judge, but not necessarily binding. So she has a little more leeway. I think Judge Mehta felt very much constricted by the language in Microsoft, which cautioned against using a divestiture remedy in the kind of case that Judge Mehta was overseeing, where it wasn't extraordinarily clear that Google's monopoly in search wouldn't have occurred if Google hadn't engaged in the conduct that was alleged in that case, which was exclusionary dealing. You have to have a strong causation standard, according to the Microsoft case, in order to use divestiture as a remedy. And in that case, Judge Mehta didn't feel he had that strong causation standard, and because of the Microsoft precedent, felt that he couldn't impose a divestiture in that case. This judge isn't necessarily bound by that.
Is it just me, or are there a lot of trials, antitrust trials lately? It seems like, there's one after the other.
There are so many. And it's funny because a lot of people sort of credit the Biden administration for all of the monopoly cases, government ones, enforcement ones that are out there now. But these investigations and a couple of the cases actually started during President Trump's first term. So there was a lawsuit, FTC versus Meta, over its acquisitions of Facebook and Instagram. We're still waiting for a liability decision on that case, but that was brought by the Trump administration and then basically prosecuted during the Biden administration. And you also have this Google search case, and you have a case against Amazon, and you have a case by the US DOJ by Apple. But one of the other things it's done is all of these actions by the government have empowered private entities as well. So you have follow-on class actions that are the consumers, or in this case, let's say the publishers in the Google ad tech case, that have been harmed by the conduct. So when you get a liability decision that says publishers have been harmed or didn't get, let's say, the best prices, well, they're going to turn around and file a class action where they're probably looking for a monetary relief more so than injunctive relief by the government. But, those then can go on for years and are additional burden on these companies. And you have that in almost every case. With Google, with ad tech, with Apple, with respect to the DOJ's allegations against Apple, against Amazon, with respect to the FTC's allegations against Amazon, and then also with respect to Google's Play Store and Apple's App Store by Epic Games, not liking the fact that there are closed ecosystems for downloading apps on either Android or iOS. And those cases have been ongoing for a long time as well.
And of course, whatever happens, Google will appeal. Thanks so much, Jen. That's Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Litigation Analyst Jennifer Rhee. And that's it for this edition of the Bloomberg Law Show. Remember, you can always get the latest legal news on our Bloomberg Law podcast. You can find them on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and at www.bloomberg.com/podcast/law. And remember to tune into the Bloomberg Law Show every weeknight at 10 p.m. Wall Street time. I'm June Grasso, and you're listening to Bloomberg.